Okay, so we all know that poetry is broken up into lines, but why? If you were to ask people what makes poetry poetry, I'm willing to bet that the most common answer might be rhymes, but I don't think lines would be too far behind in that list. After all, the line is one of the most distinguishing features of poetry. In fact, in the writing world, there's a big divide between poetry, which has lines, and prose, which doesn't. When you're writing prose, you're just writing sentences and paragraphs, and you go down to the next line when you hit the edge of the page. But even though you're still working with sentences in poetry, you're also working with lines and stanzas, and those don't break at the edge of the page or even often at the ends of sentences. So what are they doing? Why do poets break up perfectly normal sentences like that and scatter them all over the page? Why not just write in paragraphs like everyone else? Well, it's a great question, and it's one that I didn't actually have a very useful answer to for a long time. So today I thought I'd shed some light on the mystery of the line by sharing my own winding path to understanding and talking about some of the things I've learned about lines since I started writing poetry. For many of us, our earliest experience with lineated verse forms may have been with nursery rhymes, little ditties with strong rhythmic and rhyming patterns. Jack and Jill went up the hill, hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. And the strong sounds in these lines point to an early purpose of the line, to aid memory. Because our ears get used to the regular patterns of rhythm and rhyme, it becomes a lot easier to memorize the texts. Imagine, for example, how much more difficult it would be to memorize something like this. Hey sizzle praxis, the cat and the French horn. The cow launched itself over a waxing gibbous. The little dog... Hey sizzle praxis, the cat and the French horn. The cow launched itself over a waxing gibbous. And the little dog thought it was so funny, it was awfully funny. Hey sizzle praxis, the cat and the French horn. The cow launched itself over a waxing gibbous. The little dog thought it was awfully funny, showing it with laughter, and the dish took the opportunity to make its getaway, taking the spoon along as well. Older forms of poetry, like the Greek epics, were marked by rhythmic patterns that helped people to memorize and remember culturally important texts. The regularity of the rhythmic patterns could serve as an auditory cue, helping people to know what word would come next. For example, you might not remember who the dish ran away with, but you do know that it ought to rhyme with moon, and that will help you to narrow it down. So that might be an initial reason for having poetry broken into lines. Those repeated patterns in each line serve a really practical purpose in helping to sustain the memory of important texts. But, of course, so much of modern poetry doesn't rhyme at regular intervals, if it even rhymes at all, and the rhythm often isn't governed by strict metrical patterns. So if lines aren't just auditory memory tools anymore, what are they? When I started taking poetry more seriously in college, I remember breaking up my lines without any real rhyme or reason. Write some words, hit return, write some more words, hit return again. I also had it in mind that the first word of each line was the most important, so it was a little surprising to me to get my poems back from my teacher at the time with markings all over them that rearranged the lines so that they ended with words that were more interesting than the, under, and but. Really, I think that was my first concrete lesson about the line. The end of a line serves as a focal point for a reader's attention, so how you end a line is much more important than how you begin it. But knowing where to end a line wasn't enough to help me understand what the rest of the line was supposed to be doing, so I'm sure you can imagine my delight when that same teacher opened my eyes to the world of prose poetry. Imagine poetry, but without the lines. That just happens in a paragraph or two. I was really invested in other aspects of poetry, like image, compression, and precision, so the prose poem gave me an opportunity to still write poetry without having to worry about those confusing lines. Plus, they had that convention-flouting edge to them that made me feel like some kind of artistic maverick. So when I finished college and went on to poetry school, a lot of my early pieces were prose poems. And if we're honest, it was mostly because the prose poem gave me an opportunity to cover up my insecurities with something that I thought made me look kind of cool. And to be clear, I still love a good prose poem, but I am glad that I didn't get stuck there. I think I've mentioned this before, but when I was in poetry school, former poet laureate Rita Dove came to visit the program, and whenever any poet visited, I always listened eagerly to see if they could give me some kind of insight into what lines were and how they worked. And on the day that Rita Dove visited, something clicked. At one point, when she was answering someone's question, it might have even been my own, I don't really remember, she said that every line should have integrity. There should be something holding each line together, some reason that those words are together in one line. That integrity could be based on an image, building a line to convey a particular moment. Or it could be based on a sound pattern, like alliteration or rhythm. It could be built around meaning, putting emphasis on particular words, or rearranging the parts of a sentence to create secondary interpretations. It didn't matter what it was, but the principle was that each line had to have some kind of integrity. And at that moment, I got it, and I started revising my prose poems into lines. So we could talk about lines and poetry in theory all day, but I wanted to show you something that I like to ask my own students to do that I think often makes the concept of the line click for them as well. This is something you can try out on your own, but I wanted to show you how I might do it and then talk about it along the way. To get started, you're going to need your own first draft of a prose poem, or a lyrical paragraph, or some poem without lines. Whatever you call it, you'll need something like this. The attempt. I woke up too early for a Saturday, tight-coiled pain seething along the curve of my skull and into my neck. So now, the pain hollowed out by aspirin, I settle into the love seat. The washer sloshes, the dryer bumps and hums from the other room, and robins and sparrows chatter outside in the trees. Under a light blanket's easy warmth, I close my eyes, willing a surrender to a few minutes of sleep before getting to work. I wait, watching the lightening and darkening as patchy clouds slide beside the sun, and still, I wait. Don't worry if it's a triumph of literature. It's just a draft, and at this point our mission is just to uncover the secret of the line, nothing more. So once you have your prose poem, your job is to break it up into lines in two different ways so that you create two new poems. You'll end up with something like this. Here, you can see some experimentation with line and with stanzas. The content is the same, but the experience of reading changes. The lines of both versions control our attention and pacing in different ways. So let's take a look at a few lines and talk about how they work. Here, we get a set of lines that are being driven by rhythm. The water sloshes, a nice little alternation of stressed and unstressed syllables. The dryer bumps and hums, iambic trimeter. And robins and sparrows, we get a little flavor of dactyls here that slides into its natural conclusion with chatter outside in the trees. In the second version, the dryer bumps and hums from the other room. Listen to all those ums and uhs. Oh, the onomatopoeia. And some of these lines are grammatical, held together by a structural integrity. Under the light blanket's easy warmth. There's a prepositional phrase, and the lightening and darkening is the object of the verb, followed by a subordinate clause. In the second version, the first line is just a clause, no controversy there. But you can do other things too. Use the line to create alternate readings of the syntax. In the first version, the line break in the second line leaves you a split second of room to read tight-coiled as an adverbial modifier for the first line, as if to say the speaker of the poem woke up in a tight-coiled state. But surprise, as you keep reading, you're forced to reframe the coil as modifying the pain. Or later on, I close my eyes, willing. For a second, it reads as passive willingness, but then the syntax of the sentence pulls it back into a force of will, a deliberate urging on of the surrender. These readings are not ultimately what the sentences say, but the arrangement of lines gives the reader room to contemplate those secondary meanings, even if just for a second, adding a complexity to the piece that wouldn't and couldn't exist if the piece were just in a single paragraph. And if we look at the two versions side by side again, we could even characterize their overall approaches to the line. With shorter lines and more vertical length, the first version asks your eye to move around more. The second version, with longer lines, feels more like its prose counterpart. In general, I tend to read shorter lines as having more energy. Longer lines move more slowly, so they can be perhaps calmer, but they also run the risk of dragging. And while there is room for wild variation in line length, both of these pieces tend to remain pretty consistent, giving them a more cohesive sense than if we were alternating from single-word lines to lines built with 17 words and back again. Where consistently shorter lines are energetic, Wildly varying lines may feel chaotic, and that's not a bad thing so much as it is a thing to be aware of. If you're after chaos, go for it. As always, there are no strict rules, so just see what happens as you play around and take it from there. So there you have it, an introduction to the line based on my own years-long journey to figure it out, at least a little. Whatever you do, just make sure that it's intentional. Give your lines integrity, some reason for being a single unit. And of course, remember that this is guidance for reading, so don't ever feel like you need to sit down when you're reading poetry and figure out the governing principle for each line. I mean, you can, but that sounds like a quick way to make reading more of a chore than anything else. But when you are writing, it's a good idea to be on the lookout for some kind of integrity when you're creating each line of poetry. So follow your eyes, follow your ears, follow your own inner sense of what works. It's okay to do this intuitively, and surely as you spend more time reading and writing good poetry, it will become more and more intuitive. So give it a shot and see what happens. And remember, it's all just drafts until you publish it. So there's no pressure to make it perfect until about a minute before it shows up in a book somewhere. Whatever you end up doing, I hope you'd let me know how it goes, especially if you try out the exercise that we did together in this video. I'd love to hear the insights that you gain from trying it out yourself. Now though, it looks like I've got a couple of drafts of my own to play around with, so I'm gonna go do that and leave you to do your own cool things. As always, thanks for watching, and happy writing until we meet again.